There is a kind of exhaustion that does not come from doing too much. It comes from trying to use the right effort with the wrong tool. You already know this exhaustion. It's the kind that appears when the state simply doesn't move, no matter how much you think about it. You tried reasoning. You listed all the reasons why everything is okay. You analyzed where it came from. You reminded yourself that it isn't rational. You walked yourself through it, step by step, explaining why it doesn't make sense to keep feeling this way. And yet, the tightness in your chest, the thought that keeps circling, the state that remains exactly where it was, as if all that mental effort simply never reached the place it was supposed to reach. The most common conclusion at that point is a familiar one. I'm not trying hard enough. I don't have enough mental discipline. Other people can do this. The problem must be me. But what if the problem isn't the person? What if it's the direction? In 1996, neuroscientist Joseph LeDoux at New York University published a body of research that would permanently change the scientific understanding of anxiety, fear, and emotional activation. LeDoux mapped in remarkable detail the communication pathways between two structures: the amygdala, the system responsible for threat detection and response, and the prefrontal cortex, the system responsible for rational thinking, planning, and deliberate self-control. What he found was an asymmetry. The connections running from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex are more numerous, more direct, and faster than the connections running from the prefrontal cortex back to the amygdala. Put simply, the alarm system has a wide, fast pathway for influencing rational thought. Rational thought has a narrower, slower pathway with far less direct influence over the alarm system. LeDoux described two routes through which a stimulus can reach the amygdala. He called them the low road and the high road. The low road is fast, direct, and bypasses the cortex entirely. A tone of voice, a sudden movement, a particular smell. These stimuli reach the amygdala in milliseconds and trigger a physiological response before any conscious thought has had a chance to form. The high road passes through the cortex. It is slower and more capable of evaluating context and nuance, but it arrives after the alarm has already gone off. Think about an argument that begins to escalate. Your heart speeds up, your shoulders tense, your breathing becomes shallow, and at the same time, you're trying to think clearly, choose the right words, and maintain perspective. But the system that is supposed to produce that clear thinking is operating under the influence of an already activated amygdala. The cortex that should be generating the rational counterargument is, at that moment, downstream from the alarm, receiving signals, not sending them. Based on LeDoux's work, Daniel Goleman popularized the term amygdala hijack to describe states in which the upward influence of the alarm system becomes strong enough to significantly alter how the cortex processes everything that follows. But a full hijack is only one end of a spectrum. In the far more common states of persistent anxiety, ongoing worry, or background agitation that most people navigate every day, what happens is not dramatic. It is a sustained influence, subtle, continuous, and directly relevant to the question of why trying to think clearly in these states is structurally more difficult than it appears. A cortex operating under moderate amygdala influence can still think. It can still produce words, analyses, and arguments, but it does so from an altered baseline, with a narrower focus of attention, with interpretations of ambiguous information biased toward risk, with resources directed towards scanning the environment rather than calm, integrated processing. And a cortex operating in that state simply does not have the capacity to generate the argument that will deactivate the amygdala, not because the argument is bad, but because the pathway that argument would need to travel from the cortex to the amygdala is structurally less efficient than the pathway running in the opposite direction. This is not a personal failure. It is architecture. But there is something even more specific about that architecture that most people never learn. Something that explains not only why thought fails to reach the alarm system, but why trying harder often intensifies the state rather than reducing it. And the answer begins with a law described in 1908, long before any brain scanner existed. A law that describes with surgical precision what happens to cognitive performance at the exact moment we need it most. There is a window of time in the hours following an emotionally intense event during which the memory is still being formed, not permanently stored, formed. During this process, which neuroscientists call consolidation, the memory is still biologically malleable, like clay that has not fully dried, and it is being actively shaped by the hormonal activity triggered by the event itself. The hippocampus is the central structure in this process, and its function goes far beyond simply storing what happened. It is responsible for dating a memory, for placing a tag on it that says, "This happened at a specific time, in a specific context, and that context is now behind us." When the hippocampus is functioning at full capacity, this temporal contextualization happens with relative efficiency. The memory is stored with what could be called an emotional timestamp. This happened, it belongs to the past. It can be accessed when needed, but it does not need to remain on alert. Neuroscientist Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University spent decades documenting what happens to the hippocampus under prolonged exposure to elevated cortisol, the primary hormone released during sustained stress. What he found was direct and, in some ways, unsettling. Chronic stress measurably compromises hippocampal function. It reduces neurogenesis in the region. It alters the density of synaptic connections and, particularly relevant to what we are exploring, it affects the precision with which the hippocampus can place memories in time. When that capacity is compromised, the memory is still stored, but without a clear label indicating when it belongs, or with an imprecise one, with more blurred temporal boundaries. And a memory without a clear temporal label does not arrive with the feeling of belonging to the past. It can arrive, and often does, with something that feels strangely like the present. This is where sleep enters the conversation in a way that is rarely considered. The research of Matthew Walker at Berkeley and Robert Stickgold at Harvard has, over decades, built a detailed map of sleep's role in memory consolidation. What they documented is that during deep sleep, and especially during REM sleep, the hippocampus and cortex communicate in an intense and coordinated way. Memories formed during the day are gradually transferred from the hippocampus to the cortex, where they become more stable, more permanent, and more integrated with existing knowledge. Researcher Rosalind Cartwright, who spent decades studying dream content and its emotional function, proposed that REM sleep also serves as a space for effective processing, an opportunity for the nervous system to revisit emotionally significant memories under conditions of lower arousal, gradually separating, across repeated sleep cycles, the factual information from the emotional charge attached to it. Over time, with adequate sleep, a difficult memory can be accessed without triggering the full original physiological response. The facts remain. The emotional intensity decreases. The problem is that this process requires exactly what is hardest to provide after an emotionally disturbing event: quality sleep, complete sleep, sleep that reaches the stages necessary for this work to happen. Because the very memories that need to be processed during sleep are often the ones that interfere with it the most. The mind that keeps replaying the scene at 2 a.m. The difficulty reaching deep sleep precisely on the nights following something that shook the system. The feeling of waking up still carrying the weight of what happened, as if the rest had been too shallow to make any difference. It is a cycle that sustains itself. The unprocessed memory interferes with sleep. Compromised sleep reduces the ability to process the memory emotionally. And without that processing, the memory remains available with the same intensity with which it was originally formed. In 2000, neuroscientist Karim Nader published a study that profoundly shook the field of memory neuroscience. Until then, the dominant theory was that once consolidated, a memory was essentially stable, a file recorded and sealed. Karim Nader showed something radically different. Every time a memory is activated, every time it is accessed, revisited, or simply remembered, it temporarily enters a new state of malleability. It must be reconsolidated, stored again. And during this reconsolidation process, which lasts for several hours after retrieval, it can be modified by new information present in the current context, by new emotions present at the moment of retrieval, by new associations offered by the environment. This has a consequence that completely changes how we understand what happens when you mentally revisit that moment. The argument, the mistake, the moment of embarrassment. Every time you return to that scene, you are not merely remembering, you are reconsolidating. And if the emotional state present during that retrieval still carries tension, self-criticism, or shame, those emotions become incorporated into the memory during reconsolidation, making it, in some cases, even more emotionally charged than it was originally. Each anxious review can, paradoxically, strengthen the very memory you are trying to leave behind. There is another phenomenon that deepens this pattern in a way many people immediately recognize, but rarely know how to name. Psychologist Gordon Bower at Stanford University documented in the 1980s what became known as state-dependent memory. The central idea is this: memories are more easily accessed when the emotional state present during retrieval resembles the emotional state present during the original encoding. In practical terms, memories encoded during anxiety are more easily activated when you are anxious. Memories encoded during shame return more intensely when something today makes you feel ashamed, even if the situation is completely different. This means that on days when the nervous system is already overloaded for other reasons, a difficult week, a hard conversation, an accumulation of small frustrations, those memories that seemed long behind you can suddenly reappear with renewed intensity. Not because they became stronger, but because your current emotional state is opening the door to them, the same state in which they were originally encoded. If this describes something you recognize in your own system, that feeling that certain memories always seem to return at the wrong moments, with an intensity that feels disproportionate to the amount of time that has passed, this channel exists to give that experience a name. Every video here adds another piece to the map of how the mind actually works. Subscribe so the next one is already waiting for you. But there is still something that none of these mechanisms fully explains on its own. Why do some memories keep coming back even when sleep has been reasonably good, even when there is no obvious environmental trigger, even when the person is not in a particularly difficult emotional state? Why, in moments of silence, the shower, the drive, the minutes before sleep, does the system seem to actively choose that file among all available files to revisit? The answer lies in a brain network that becomes active systematically whenever you are not doing anything in particular. And what that network does with free time is one of the most surprising discoveries neuroscience has made in the last 2 decades. There is an autonomous system within the body that regulates activation, heart rate, breathing, and muscle tension. It did not evolve to understand words. It evolved long before words existed. And the signals it learned to recognize as safe or dangerous belong to a vocabulary far older than any argument the cortex can formulate. Neuroscientist Stephen Porges, who developed polyvagal theory over several decades, described a process he called neuroception. Neuroception is not perception. Perception involves awareness. It involves the cortex, the ability to name, reflect, and evaluate. Neuroception operates below that level. It is the continuous, automatic, pre-conscious assessment of signals coming from the environment and from the body itself, signals that inform the nervous system where the present moment falls on the spectrum between safety and threat, and it happens first, before the first thought about the situation, before the first internal sentence about how you're feeling. The system has already decided which state to inhabit, and when the cortex finally arrives, it arrives afterward. This explains something almost everyone has experienced, but rarely been able to name. You're in a conversation that isn't going well. The words the other person is using are reasonable. The argument, technically speaking, makes sense, but something in the tone, the speed, the pitch, the lack of variation, sends the system somewhere the words alone would never justify. Or the opposite. You're going through a difficult moment. Your system is activated, and someone enters the room. They don't say anything particularly wise. They don't offer a solution. They are simply present, with a specific quality of presence, calm, unhurried, without urgency. And something in your system begins, almost imperceptibly, to soften. It wasn't the argument that changed the state. It was the signal. Neuroception reads the rhythm of the voices around you. It reads facial expressions, especially the regions around the eyes and forehead that are associated with signals of safety or threat. It reads movement, proximity, and temperature. It reads the breathing patterns of the people sharing the environment. None of these signals are processed primarily by the cortex. They all reach the autonomic nervous system through pathways that are older, faster, and more direct than conscious thought. Neuroscientist Allan Schore of UCLA spent decades mapping what he calls right brain to right brain communication. The central idea is this: nervous systems regulate one another, not through words and arguments, but through nonverbal, subcortical signals that one organism transmits and another receives automatically. Prosody, gesture, rhythm, presence. What Shore's work documents is that the ability to self-regulate, to return to balance after a period of activation, is to a large extent learned in the presence of other nervous systems that already know how to do it. Before an organism learns to regulate itself, it learns what regulation looks like, feels like, and sounds like by being close to someone who is already regulated. This helps explain why, during moments of intense activation, the presence of a calm person can accomplish what 10 minutes of careful reasoning could not. Not because they said something especially correct, because their nervous system was transmitting, through channels the cortex does not control, a signal that the other person's nervous system could receive directly, without interpretation, without translation. Researchers Sarah Garfinkel and Hugo Critchley at the University of Sussex have spent years building a detailed map of what they call interoception, the brain's ability to read signals from the body itself: heart rate, breathing rhythm, visceral tension, body temperature. What their research shows is that these signals are not merely peripheral information about physical state. They are central inputs in the process by which the nervous system evaluates safety. The body is not the container of the nervous system, it is one of its primary languages. And this has a direct implication that completely changes how we think about what is possible during a moment of activation. When breathing is deliberately slowed, especially when the exhalation is extended beyond the inhalation, the vagus nerve, which connects the brainstem to virtually every major organ in the torso, sends a signal to the central nervous system. Not a thought, a physiological signal, one that says, in the only language this system recognizes before the cortex becomes involved, the situation allows you to slow down. This is why slow breathing during a difficult moment is not merely a distraction or a superficial relaxation technique. It is an intervention in the correct language. The system is not being persuaded, it is being informed. Think about the difference in practice. A person in a state of high anxiety tells themselves, "There's no reason to feel this way. Everything is fine. I know everything is fine." And the state remains. The same person, without saying anything to themselves, slows their breathing, inhaling for 4 counts, exhaling for 6, for 2 minutes. Their heart rhythm begins to change. The tension in their shoulders and jaw softens slightly, and the system, reading those signals, begins not to be convinced, but to receive information that perhaps it is safe to let go a little. It is not magic. It is the system responding to the language it has always understood. But this is where something emerges that very few people consider. And it may be the most counterintuitive piece of everything this channel has explored so far. Because up to this point, the question has been, why doesn't thinking work when the system is activated? The answer has been mapped with remarkable precision. The next question, however, is different and more unsettling. What happens when signals of safety finally begin to arrive? When activation finally starts to decrease? When the system begins receiving the message that it can let go? For most people, what should happen in those moments seems simple. Relief, rest, the feeling that everything is okay. But for some nervous systems, especially those that have spent a long time calibrated for vigilance, what arrives is not quite that. What arrives is something else, something that should not be there in a moment like that. And understanding why that something appears precisely when safety begins to arrive changes everything about how we understand the difficulty of truly resting. What appears when safety finally begins to arrive for a nervous system calibrated for vigilance is this: another alarm. Not because something new has become frightening, but because the drop in activation itself, the very signal that things are improving, is unfamiliar territory for that system. And unfamiliar territory is not automatically classified as safe. Sometimes it is classified as the opposite, A nervous system that has spent weeks, months, or years predominantly activated gradually recalibrates what it considers normal. And when the correct bodily signals finally begin to appear, slower breathing, shoulders relaxing, heart rhythms beginning to change, the system does not necessarily interpret them as relief. Sometimes it interprets them as the absence of vigilance, as though it is lowering its guard at the wrong moment, as though relaxing is, in itself, a risk. This is where the paradox of control completes itself, because the same system that does not respond to rational arguments when activated also does not quietly welcome signals of safety when they arrive. It questions them. It feels slightly uncomfortable around them. Sometimes it interprets them as evidence that something remains unresolved. And the attempt to force relaxation, to consciously command yourself to let go, restarts the cycle of effort that is itself a form of activation. Neuroscientist Richard Davidson of the University of Wisconsin, Madison has spent decades studying how emotional regulation functions in the brain and, more importantly, how it changes. What his research documents is that emotional regulation is not a fixed skill. It can be trained. The structure and activity of regions associated with regulation, particularly the medial prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate cortex, show measurable changes in response to practices that work with bodily signals rather than against them. The central point of Davidson's research is not that these practices produce immediate relaxation. It is that, over time, they change the threshold at which the system interprets stimuli as threats. The baseline level of activation shifts. The window of tolerance, described by Dan Siegel in the previous section, expands, and gradually, the system begins to recognize as familiar a state that once felt strange. Safety, in other words, can be learned by the nervous system, but it is learned through signals, not through persuasion. Researcher James Pennebaker at the University of Texas documented something that, at first glance, seems to contradict everything explored in this video. Writing about emotionally difficult experiences, he found, produces measurable improvements in psychological health and in some cases even physical health, but the mechanism is not what it appears to be. Pennebaker identified that the benefit does not come from analyzing the experience. It does not come from finding the perfect argument about what happened. It comes from giving shape to the experience, from narrating rather than interrogating, from moving through the emotional content instead of circling around it from a distance. What changes during expressive writing is not the rational conclusion about the event. What changes is the physiological state during the act of giving it form, the regulation that emerges from moving through the experience, not from containing it. This sheds light on what actually works when thinking does not. It is not the absence of cognition. It is cognition that moves with the state rather than against it, that accompanies rather than suppresses, that gives shape rather than argues. Researchers Emily and Amelia Nagoski, in their work on the biological stress cycle, described something that connects all of these pieces in a remarkably concrete way. The body's stress response is not merely a state. It is a cycle with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that cycle must be completed, physically, for the system to return to baseline. In the environment in which this system evolved, completion was almost always physical. Running from danger, confronting a threat, reaching safety. The body completed the cycle through movement. Activation found resolution. In the modern world, threats are often symbolic, social, and lacking any clear physical resolution. A difficult meeting ends, but the body is still carrying the activation it generated to prepare for it. An aggressive email arrives, but there is nothing to run from and nothing to fight. A worry that lasts for weeks keeps the system mobilized without any physical event signaling that the cycle can finally end. And a cycle that never completes does not disappear. It accumulates, contributing to the background state that makes each new stimulus slightly harder to absorb and every attempt to relax slightly more resisted. One of the most measurable ways of tracking this process is through heart rate variability, the natural variation in the intervals between heartbeats. Contrary to what might seem intuitive, a healthy, well-regulated heart does not beat at perfectly uniform intervals. It varies. This variation, known as heart rate variability, or HRV, is one of the most robust indicators of vagal tone and autonomic nervous system regulation. When HRV is low, when the intervals become more rigid and uniform, the system is under strain. When HRV increases, the system becomes more flexible, more capable of responding to new stimuli without leaving its window of tolerance. And what HRV research consistently shows aligns with everything explored throughout this video. The behaviors that increase HRV and therefore expand regulatory capacity are not primarily cognitive. They are bodily signals. Rhythmic breathing with extended exhalations, physical movement that completes cycles of activation, social connection with a regulated presence, practices that train the system to recognize safety not through arguments, but through repeated signals. Here is the central thesis of everything explored in this video. You cannot think your way out of a state that did not enter through thought. The alarm is not an argument that requires a counter-argument. It is a physiological signal that requires another physiological signal in response. A cycle that needs to be completed, not interrupted. A language that must be answered in its own language, not translated into words, no matter how accurate or true those words may be. Thought does have a role in this process, but it is not the role most people assign to it. Its role is not to replace nervous system regulation. Its role is to create the intention to move toward what the system actually needs, to name what is happening so that the attempt to control can be replaced by a willingness to move through, and to reduce the narrative of shame, I should be able to control this, which so often adds a second layer of activation to the state that already exists. Subscribe to follow what comes next on this channel. Each video builds upon the previous one, and the next takes this story into territory most people never expect to encounter. The asymmetry in the communication pathways between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, mapped by Joseph LeDoux at New York University, shows that the alarm system has a wider, faster, and more numerous pathway for influencing rational thought than the reverse, explaining why rational arguments have structurally limited access to states of activation. The low road described by LeDoux reaches the amygdala before any conscious thought has formed, and the concept of the amygdala hijack, popularized by Daniel Goleman based on this research, describes states in which this bottom-up influence dominates conscious processing. The Yerkes-Dodson law demonstrates that the relationship between arousal and cognitive performance follows an inverted U-curve, and that at high levels of activation, the most sophisticated cognitive functions deteriorate measurably, precisely when the effort to think clearly becomes most intense. The window of tolerance, proposed by Siegel of UCLA, describes the range of activation within which the nervous system maintains integrated processing, and how, outside that range, cognitive strategies progressively lose effectiveness. The ironic process theory documented by Daniel Wegner at Harvard shows that attempts to suppress a thought or state increase its accessibility because monitoring suppression requires repeatedly activating the very thing being suppressed. James Gross's research at Stanford on expressive suppression demonstrates that actively containing an emotional state is associated with increased sympathetic activation. The effort of suppression is itself a form of mobilization with cumulative physiological cost. Neuroception, proposed by Stephen Porges, describes the nervous system's preconscious and continuous evaluation of safety before the cortex has any opportunity to participate, responding to nonverbal signals such as prosody, rhythm, facial expression, and breathing patterns rather than rational arguments. The right brain to right brain communication mapped by Allan Schore at UCLA documents how nervous systems co-regulate through nonverbal subcortical signals, explaining why the presence of a regulated person can alter another person's state without a single precise word being spoken. Interoception, studied by Sarah Garfinkel and Hugo Critchley at the University of Sussex, shows that internal bodily signals, heart rate, breathing rhythm, visceral tension, are central inputs in the process by which the nervous system evaluates safety, not peripheral information. Richard Davidson's research at the University of Wisconsin, Madison on the neuroplasticity of emotional regulation, demonstrates that regulatory capacity changes through practice, particularly through approaches that work with bodily signals, altering the threshold at which the system interprets stimuli as threats. James Pennebaker's work at the University of Texas on expressive writing reveals that the benefit of giving narrative form to difficult experiences does not come from rational analysis of the event, but from moving through the emotional content itself, producing regulation through movement within the state rather than around it. The stress cycle model developed by Emily and Amelia Nagoski establishes that the biological stress response has a beginning, middle, and end, and that this cycle must be physically completed for the system to return to baseline. Unfinished cycles accumulate as background load. And heart rate variability, as a marker of vagal tone and regulatory capacity, demonstrates that the behaviors that genuinely expand the window of tolerance are consistently bodily signals rather than cognitive strategies. If any part of this video describes something you have experienced, the specific exhaustion of trying with all your intelligence to move out of a state that simply would not budge, leave a comment. One word. What changed after understanding that the problem was never a lack of effort? It was the direction of the effort, because there is something about what we've explored here that leads directly into a territory most people never expect to visit. We've seen that a nervous system calibrated for vigilance can resist the very signals of safety, that a reduction in activation, the very sign that things are improving, can be interpreted as unfamiliar territory, as lowering your guard at the wrong moment. But what happens when this goes beyond momentary resistance? What happens when the system not only resists safety, but begins associating moments of well-being, genuine pleasure, and real calm with something that should not be felt? When relaxation begins to produce not relief, but guilt? When feeling good suddenly feels like the most dangerous moment of all? This pattern has a precise mechanism, and it is far more common than it appears. A nervous system that has learned, over a long enough period of time, that danger arrives during moments of distraction begins, quietly, to treat moments of well-being as the waiting room for the next problem, not as rest, as vulnerability. Why feeling good can activate the very same system that detects threat, and why some nervous systems learn to sabotage, completely automatically, the exact moments when they could finally rest. That's the next video.